So to my immediate left is David Almonds, who has twice won the Whitbread Children's Book Award. His first novel, Skellig, also won the Carnegie Medal, while his second, Kit's Wilderness, won the Smarties Award Silver Medal and was shortlisted for the Guardian Award. The Fire Eaters won the Whitbread, the Smarties Gold Award, and was shortlisted for the Carnegie Medal. His latest novel, Clay, published by Delacorte here in the States, was shortlisted for the Costa Children's Book Award and the Carnegie Medal. In 2010, he was awarded the prestigious Hans Christian Andersen Prize for a lifetime achievement in children's writing. He lives with his family in Northumberland. And to my far left is Sofi Oksanen, who is a novelist and playwright of Finnish-Estonian descent. She is the author of the novels Stalin's Cows, Baby Jane, and most recently Purge, set in wartime 1940s Estonia and the 1990s during the Soviet occupation. Purge, just out now from Grove Press here in the States, the first book to win both of Finland's top literary awards, the Finlandia and the Runeberg, and a #1 bestseller, marks her English language debut. The novel is based on her acclaimed and controversial play of the same name, originally staged at the National Theatre in Helsinki in 2007. In 2009, Oksanen was named Estonia's Person of the Year. She lives in Helsinki. So please welcome me and join me in welcoming them. I have to tell both of you before we proceed how much I really, really enjoyed reading your work, and what a great pairing I think this is, because though the tones of the various works involved here are very, very different, I do think there is this unified sense of youth and children and the things that happen to children when they're young that then are threaded through their later experiences in life. So David, I'd like to start with you and just discussing how you had written some adult books before you turned to writing children's books, and I was wondering if you could discuss somewhat how you decided to make that transition and what the ramifications have been as a result of focusing on children in your work.
Yeah, when I grew up, and I always knew I wanted to be a writer from the time I was a little boy. When I grew up, I thought, I'm an intelligent grown-up adult. What I need to do is to write books for intelligent grown-up adults, which is what I did. And for several years, and was mainly a short story writer, and had stories published in lots of places, and novels rejected. But as we do, we just crack on and keep on going. And I went through various kind of, artistic crises and personal crises, and then I thought, what will I do? So I then wrote a book of short stories that grew out of my own life, which was about my childhood, but it was a kind of mixture of real people and imaginary people, real events and imaginary events, and they were written for adults, and I sent them out into the world. And when I did that, a few peculiar things started to happen. One was that I began to re-experience the kind of imaginative and physical and emotional life of a child again. And also I began to, for the first time, to reach a kind of big audience. Instead of having 25 readers, I had 125. And then I finished those stories, and lots of things had changed through the process of writing these stories. I walked to the mailbox and put these stories into the mailbox to send off to my long-suffering literary agent, because the last thing she wanted to see from a barely published writer was a collection of short stories, but there they were, because we have to do what we have to do. And I sent it off, and I turned around from the mailbox, and I was walking along the street, and my head was empty. I'd finished the book, I'd sent it off, and I thought, great, I'll have a bit of time off. I won't write for a few days. And as I was walking along the street, I heard in the back of my head, I found him in the garage on a Sunday afternoon. And all I had was one sentence, one little fragment, but it came with such energy and force, as if somebody was walking along behind me that day and saying, here, son, you've been working really hard. Have this. And I went back to where I was staying at the time. Instead of taking time out, I sat down, I began to write this book. And I realized that it was the culmination of everything I'd done before. I got halfway down the first page. I knew so much about it, even to the length it was going to be. And I got into the third paragraph, and I thought, it's a book for young people. And I felt just astonished, because I hadn't expected to do that. But also I felt really energized and really just liberated. Liberated was the word. And I wrote this book, which seemed to come from nowhere and just kept on coming and coming and coming and coming. And I finished it, and I found myself as a children's writer, to my astonishment. And that book was called Skellig, and it kind of changed my life and changed all of my thinking about stories. And ever since, I've written mainly for young people, mainly for children. And one of the things that I do love about it is, you know, as a writer, as a storyteller, someone who works with language and different forms of story, is the kind of abundance of story forms that you can work in writing for young people. Because young people don't put up boundaries, they don't kind of put in false adult categories to what stories are. They will accept stories in forms that to lots of adults would seem very challenging and just weird. Children can take weirdness and can take challenging stories. So that's a bit about my journey to what I write.
That's great. Sophie, I'm interested to know if it was a similar, because you have worked in various media, and so it's not just one genre that you've written either. I'm interested to know kind of how you, with your first novel, was it something that fiction writing had really grabbed you, or was it a version of other writings that had come to you, or was there a similar moment for you?
Well, I have always wanted to be an author, so writing was a very obvious choice to what to do with my life. And my first novel, Stalin's Cows, I started it. I have to say that I'm a bit superstitious sometimes, and my favorite authors had published their first novels before they were 27, and so I was 24 then, and when I understood, okay, I'm 24 now, I really have to.
Time was ticking.
Yeah, and well, I published at the age of 26, and so I made it. But it was a story about teenage girl and a bit. And about eating disorders. I wanted to describe this disorder so that all different sides would be in the book. That means the psychological, physiological, as well as the sociological, and what kind of world you can have eating disorder. Eating disorders, of course, have a very long history, so there's nothing new about that. But I wanted to describe, well, how different kind of cultures can give that kind of background or soil where you might be very prone to have eating disorder. So, and it's also a metaphorical level there as well. But my latest novel, Purge, it started, well, there were different reasons, but one of them was the story I had heard as a child. And I was born in Finland, but we visited our Estonian relatives very often. And during the Soviet occupation, you couldn't actually talk about the real events, real things. So, and of course, because our phones were tapped and letters were read, which meant that only possibility to talk about real things was when you meet another person. And we also preferred actually talking outside, because you never know. You never know, yeah. And so I heard all these stories about Estonian past sitting in the backyard of my grandparents. And one of them was related to my my relative, and she was during the Second World War. She was living with her old mother alone in the countryside, and they found a wounded soldier from their backyard, and he was left behind the troops, and he asked for help. And at that time, Nazi German and Soviet forces were coming back and forth on the soil of Estonia, so you didn't actually know what will be the result and who will win. And so they thought that, okay, we will heal this soldier and wait for the better time. And they had to build a secret cabin for the soldier. And he was lying there and getting better, but somebody from the village turned them in. And so the secret police of Soviet Union came, and they took the young girl for questioning. They didn't want the old mother, they wanted just the girl. And she came back next morning. She looked like she was physically okay, but she never spoke since. And that's, when I heard about this as a child, I didn't actually think that what it really meant, what had happened, what happens to somebody if you just stop speaking. She wasn't mute, just not speaking anymore. And well, of course, as an adult, I understand what has happened, and I guess my relatives anyway, they knew what had happened, but as a child I didn't know that, and that's when I started to be interested in different kind of trauma reactions, and also how it might affect the rest of her life. The girl never married. She stayed with her old mother until she died, and just never spoke again.
That's very eye-opening and relevant, and it's so relevant, as you're saying, to that novel, because there is a question, because you're dealing with different time periods, what people know when, and what happens to children when they know something earlier and hide it for a great period of time. David, I know in many of your books, especially in Skellig, there's this idea of what the narrator knows versus what the people around him know. A wonderful thread that you have in that story is the main character has an infant sister whose health is very, very precarious over the course of the book. And we never quite know to what extent he really understands the nature of her problems. His parents keep him in the dark as to what's happening with her. How do you, it must be a very, very challenging thing as a writer in general to affect, for both of you, to affect that idea of keeping things focused, keeping it from somebody's viewpoint without letting other information to which the author is not privy encroach on the story. So how do you negotiate that? Because it seems to be a common thread among many of your books in particular. How do you negotiate that, and has that changed over time? Or I'd be interested to know.
I think about lots of kind of what seem to be kind of structural techniques. If you think about them too much as an author, you're not going to be able to do it. I think if you try to be too conscious about exactly what you're doing and how you're going to structure your book and what different people in your story will know, then I think you actually will find it very difficult. It's interesting with Skellig, you know, that people write books about Skelligs and dissertations and they send them to me and they say, "Dear Mr. Almond, this was really clever the way you did this on page 17 and matched it with what was on page 98. I said, "Yes, it is, isn't it?" I wonder how I did that. And I think, and that sounds, you know, it's kind of throwaway, but it's actually true. And I think, you know, I think the act of writing is an act of exploration and an act of kind of discovery. And I think the writer almost sets off kind of knowing nothing. You know, like Michael at the beginning of Skellig, Michael knows just about nothing, and he goes into a place and discovers something. And in the process of discovering the something in the world, he discovers the something about himself. And that's what, I mean, that's what growing up is, isn't it? And maybe one of the reasons that I write for young people is because the act of growing up seems to me very similar to the act of writing. You know, you write a story, and afterwards you can say what the story was and why these certain things happened. But when you're in the process of doing it, a lot of the time, actually, you haven't got a clue. You just know you have to do it because it feels kind of the sensation of it is true, is right for the story. And I think a lot of that is to do with the fact that I think we all have an innate understanding of story form. You know, I think we all understand narratives and how narratives work because stories are the things that hold us together. So I think as a writer, you know, I have to allow myself, trust myself to be able to do those, to make those discoveries. Right. When I set off, you know, it's like when I was a kid, people said, if you're going to write a story, you have to know what's going to happen at the beginning, what's going to happen in the middle, what's going to happen at the end. And I used to try and do that. And when I was setting off to become a published writer, I thought, maybe that's what you've got to do. But of course, you know, as D.H. Lawrence said, you try and pin a story down, it just picks the pin up and runs away with it.
And Sophie, with Purge in particular, there's such a decided structure to it because towards the end, without giving anything away, you very artfully constructed what we know. The main character, Alita, at first we get the sense that she's somewhat mentally out of it and she doesn't know exactly what's happening to her, but she actually carries a lot of secrets with her. And the character of Linda, who's her sister, her niece, who is kind of fills the role that you were describing earlier of the child who is really violated politically and physically. and it has repercussions for her life. Did you, you know, there is that sense then too of what Linda understands about the situations then, and then what she understands now. Could you talk a little bit about that character in particular, and then how you, because she's not the main character, you know, the story that you heard may have inspired you, but Alida and Zara, the two main characters, assumed that role. So I'd be interested to hear too, in the way that David's talking, how you dealt with those issues of what she understood when and
Well, Purge was first a play, so when I was writing the play, I didn't know that I'm going to write a novel as well. And when I was writing the play, I had to think about the actors on stage, and also there was a quite practical side actually that affected how it was formed, because I was given the actors and the casting was actually made. So, which meant that, for example, Ingel, Alida's sister, is not on stage, and that is something that I had decided already, because I just wanted her to be on stage, but not physically. And after well, the rehearsals were going on already, but I couldn't get more actors. And because they had their programs already done, so I couldn't actually make any kind of experience that if somebody's coming or going or something like that. But anyway, I started to write a piece for Ingel, who is not on stage, because I was thinking that perhaps she could be as a voice. And then suddenly I noticed that I was writing a novel actually. So it started with Ingel's voice, writing the novel. But then it's very hard to say why some characters are the characters that you start to write from their point of view. Alida was obvious because I wanted to have the old lady in her 80s, and I wanted her to be, I mean, really old. And then the young girl, and then Alida is also as a younger person present in the play as well, in the novel. But I don't know. They just turn out to be characters that some just are more present, and some just I can't make nothing out of them for one reason or another. But there's no really rational reason for that.
There's a kind of creative impulse you're feeling that changes it over time. Yeah, it
just feels right to have that kind of structure.
And David, you had the opposite experience, because with Skellig, for example, it had begun as a book, and then you had written the play of it as well. So how that must have been, there was a lot of economizing that had to go on in that process, I assume, as well, correct?
There was a lot of things that had to be thrown out, which actually I was quite happy with. I do love collaboration. I love the way stories can move out from the page. You know, I'm kind of incredibly possessive about the layout of my books and the words on the books and everything about that. But as soon as they begin to move onto the stage, then I'm quite free. And when I agreed to do Skellig, I'd written one play before that, and I just had to take a deep breath and say, yes, of course I can do that. And, but the moment I think that really helped me was, I'd never seen myself as a playwright, but just after Skellig was published, I went and read it in a school in Newcastle, which is a city near where I live. And they put me in a class of very young children, and I thought they were just too young. And I read a bit of the first page of Skellig to them, and then told them the rest of the story. And there were sort of 75 and 6-year-olds sitting there looking up at me. I thought, oh no, get me away from these kids. And I sort of gave them enough, I thought, to satisfy the needs of the school. And I started to back away. And I saw two boys stand up from the back of the room, and they ran around the side of the room, and they came to me and said, David, that was fantastic. I said, we're going out into the yard now. He's Michael, I'm Skellig, come on. And they dashed into the yard, and they began to act out Skellig.
Wow.
And I thought, oh yes, for children, the classification of forms doesn't exist. The fluidity of a story being acted out was quite kind of natural to them. So I took strength from them and said, if they can do it, if two 6-year-old boys can do it in a schoolyard in Newcastle, then maybe I can do it for the stage. And I realized a lot about the playfulness of all writing, but especially writing for the stage. And I remember the first workshops of Skellig, and the first production, Skellig was played by a fantastic actor called David Almonds, who was a wonderful actor and a wonderful physical presence. And when David did the first workshop, he stood up and he began to be Skellig. And he moved his hands and he moved his body. I thought, oh, it's my mother. And I realized lots about my story from seeing an actor act it out in a workshop. And that again gave me lots of kind of strength and encouragement to say, oh yes, you know, I can release it to them and they can kind of show me the story back again. And again, I think it's a lot to do with the unconscious. You know, unconsciously, we're working out lots of things in our stories that often we don't understand. And one of the great things about seeing it on the stage, and the great thing about adapting stuff for the stage, is that a whole new layer of meaning is exposed, you know, hopefully for the audience, but also for the writer as well.
With your first two novels in particular, I mean, generally the tone of your work is relatively adult, but I would imagine that especially with your first novel, as you were dealing with issues of eating disorders and things of that nature, that there may have been younger readers, particularly people in their teenagers, who may have responded to your work. Did you have any particular responses on that front that you found particularly resonant, or that, you know, people that spoke to you on that level that weren't just adult readers coming to your work?
Yeah, I have readers from all ages, and actually when I started to work on Stalin's Cows, I had a certain plan. I knew that older people, they wouldn't read a book about eating disorders, even though they should, because their children are having eating disorders, and so on. So I thought that, okay, there must be something, how am I going to get them to read the book? And then again, I also wanted to write about Soviet Estonia and Soviet Union and Soviet occupation, because I had noticed that people of my age, they don't actually remember the Soviet Union anymore. They have any kind of connection to that. And even though the memories of Soviet Union is still, and its a connection to Russia, it's still affecting in Europe. So I thought that, okay, how am I going to get the younger readers to read about, I mean, Soviet Union? It doesn't sound too interesting for teenagers. So I thought that, okay, if I can combine these two levels, then there's a possibility that those young people who, anyway, they read quite a lot about eating disorders, eating disorder literature, and if they take and read the book, because it's an eating disorder book, then they will anyway read the Soviet side as well. And if those older men, for example, who are interested in Cold War and all that stuff, war history, if they take the novel because they want to read about that side, they will anyway, they have to read also the eating disorder part. And actually, it was a successful experiment in that sense that even the combination of these subjects, I mean, eating disorders and Soviet Union, it sounds a bit strange, I admit. But still, I have male readers over 70s, and as well as 15-year-old girls and boys as well. So in that sense, it worked out.
But certainly because so much of your work deals with the objectification of people. I mean, especially, you know, women in particular are objectified by those political situations. So in a way, it is a very logical connection to make between the two. One story that has come very much to prominence in the States in the past month or so is this, I don't know how aware you are of this, but a very tragic case in Massachusetts of a young high school girl, Irish girl who had immigrated to the States, who was, people keep saying, kind of bullied to death, you know, that her classmates, many of them, had relentlessly pursued her and bullied her, and eventually she very tragically committed suicide because of their really malignant behavior. And I'm interested to know, you know, again, speaking about children and how they're approaching your work, you know, if you feel that maybe that discourse is changing somewhat, that, you know, we have technology makes people so close to each other now, and there's a proximity that people have to each other that makes it more dangerous in a way, but theoretically we're becoming more accepting of certain people and certain societies. And David, I'm interested to know, especially since you've written a number of children's books, if you see the audience changing somewhat, or if you find relevance to your own work in that vein, or how that might speak to you.
I mean, we've had similar cases in the UK, you know, where kids get bullied and they commit suicide. Or, I don't know, I mean, in the UK, we have this year's great kind of demonization of children. And, you know, 2 years ago it was knife crime. In the UK, if you read the newspapers, you would imagine that if you went to an English city, kids would be just running around all over the English cities, just stabbing each other. And you know, some of the newspapers broadcast this, and it seemed to be true. But the actual evidence proved that actually knife crime during that time had decreased. I mean, in a similar vein, a few years ago, we had killer dogs that were going to kill everyone. You know, at that time, you imagined that England was full of dogs that were going to kill everybody. And again, it was proved that, you know, actually that there were hardly any killer dogs.
That's comforting. Thank you.
So England's okay. So I'm generally really skeptical about these kind of scare things, because we see them all the time in England. But the evidence is that things are really pretty much the same as they always have been. It just, that things, I think, get blown out of proportion. So I'm talking about, you know, the UK experience. And one of the things that it does produce for me, which is really interesting, is that when I go and I speak to kids, and I'll read something from my books about what the children in my book do, and often the kids will come and say, what, so they just went out? They just went out of the house, and they went across the field, what? And nobody looked after them, and nobody was watching them. And I think what it has done in the UK, and I don't know if it's the same here, is to make children really suspicious of adults, and adults really kind of cagey of children. And I think if we allow these kind of scare things to take too much force, I think it's, of course they're terrible things do happen, but I remember in my own childhood, terrible things that were happening that were swept under the carpet. And, you know, if we went back, say, 40 years, we could expose so many dreadful things that were happening. I mean, it's happening now, say, in the Catholic Church, for instance. So I suppose what I'm saying is that I don't think that things are really as bad as they often are portrayed to be.
And Sophie, would you, do you think for younger generations of children now, I mean, a lot of your book takes place in the early 90s and does not necessarily come to 2010 to discuss those things. Do you think in the ensuing period there, in the past 18 years from when the story takes place and now, if there has been some change in that direction, or if things have stayed the same, or is there some development there?
Well, a few words about school shootings, as we have them in Finland as well, and actually they were copycatting the U.S. murders, and that had triggered a great debate in Finland. But that is, for example, on the other hand, it's something that Estonians don't understand. That why do you have there? Are you so Americans? Are you so Americans?
Right.
And which is a bit strange, because it's just too easy to get guns, and then mental health care should be better, because those killers. Shooters, they were all, quite obviously, before they killed themselves, they were desperately in the need of mental health care. And, but it is very hard to say from this day that is it really so that before there were less these disorders, or is it just so that we are just now giving names to those disorders? Because, for example, bulimia as an eating disorder was diagnosed 1972, but it doesn't mean that it didn't exist before, because even Romans enjoyed themselves with eating disorders. So
the vomitorium.
yeah. So. But it wasn't until 1972 that the disease had a name. So I don't know if it's just the medicalization of the society. I don't think we had that kind of distress. I don't think the world was happier before. But on the other hand, perhaps we just are defining things differently.
Are there things, and you mentioned this a fair bit, where there are people who are adopting Western dress or Western films they're watching, and are there things that you think during that time period or currently people are adopting that are beneficial?
Western clothes were very important, jeans especially, and trainers. But then, after Estonia regained the independence in 1991, and in Purge, everything is happening just after regaining the independence. In a way, the big quest for freedom had ended, because, okay, independence, freedom. But I remember that time very well, because then we thought that, okay, occupation is over, now the freedom, liberty, everything, and that led to the situation where you could sell booze 24 hours, and all these kind of restrictions were away. But actually, the world didn't get better in that sense, that they didn't make people happier if you can buy booze 24 hours a day. Certainly, the society had turned to a society without any kind of social welfare. The gap between very rich ones and very poor ones was and is still very strong, and getting bigger all the time. And so the freedom, and actually I'm writing about also freedom and a quest for freedom when it comes to your body and control of your body and so on. So, and the funny thing is that mental disorders were not actually known in Soviet Union, in that sense that it was mental health care was used as a political weapon. So if you didn't agree with the party, that meant that you were crazy. So, but after regaining the independence, the society was the mental health care was not used for political purposes anymore, but still that doesn't mean that people had really changed their opinions about crazy people. They were still considered a little bit not seen as a disease as we see them in the Western country. And it has been quite hard to try to, for example, take care of human rights of mentally disabled somehow, because it is still considered like something odd and something you should avoid, and so on. So yeah, sorry. No,
No. I'm just glad to know that I'm not crazy when my friends call me crazy. I'm just not agreeing with people. But David, this is intriguing to me, because so much of your work it's almost metaphysical in a way, but there is a I like the idea of hearing how kids are amazed that people can run out of their houses and do recreational things that are very active and don't rely on being cooped up in your home and being reliant on certain technological advances. There is a sylvan nature to what a lot of your characters are doing, that they're communing with nature in a way, they're stepping outside of their bodies, and in many cases feeling their bodies more distinctly than they would if they just stayed where they were. So there is an idea there of connecting with the more fundamental recreational activities of being a child. Is that something, I mean, it seems like something that you care very deeply about and that you find that common thread for your characters?
I think it is, and I know when I was a kid, you come to America. In America, I remember I had a book called Kit's Wilderness, and I did a tour of the States, and everywhere I went, I said, well, I'm talking about the wilderness in England, and I said, you know, we've got Yosemite and we've got, you know, we've got Alaska. These are wildernesses. And, but I think a lot of my work is to do with that sensation that we need to have some kind of contact with something that is kind of beyond us and that is physically different, that is therefore most kind of spiritually different, but a place that we can go to where we can kind of challenge ourselves to see what we are. And when I began to write for children, I found that my stories just began to take on a kind of mythic trajectory, you know, that the kids immediately just start shooting out into the darkness and into dangerous places. I say, what are you going there for? You know? But I had to kind of allow them to do that, that there was this sense that kids were going out into the darkness, the wilderness, to kind of test themselves out and come back again. And I think when I was a kid, you know, and it's not, I'm not being nostalgic about the past, but when I was a kid, it's just true that in many ways we had more freedom than kids have now, because we would just go out in the morning and say, I'm off, Mum. Say, okay, see you tonight, and we'd come back after dark and we'd have been gone all day. And very few children have that experience now. And I mean, I'm a parent, and I wouldn't let my daughter do it. But I think it kind of signifies something that somehow children will, even if you stop them, children will find a way of doing that, of exploring the wilderness. Even if they're sitting inside their own house, playing with a PlayStation, at some point there's something that they will be doing which is inside themselves. They'll be kind of finding somewhere to contact some wilderness. And where we live in the country, but I know my daughter one day, she went to, we live in the country, we're surrounded by English wilderness, which is moorland, but there's a very tame little park just across the street, across the lane from where we live. And when we began to allow her to go there on her own with her friend, she went across to the park and play on the swings and everything. And she came back one day and her eyes were just glowing. She said, "You've got to come with me to Tall Trees, Dad." I said, "Where's Tall Trees?" She said, "Oh, it's fantastic. It's this huge place." She said, "Man, it's really frightening." And she took me to the park. I said, "Where's Tall Trees?" And she walked me away from the swings and to this little group of shrubs where there was a little stream trickling. And she led me and she tiptoed in. She sat down. She said, "Isn't it amazing?" And it was a tiny place. You know, I could stand up and just look around and touch. But she had found, which all the kids in the village had found, an area of wilderness. And I think it's because we all, in order to grow up, I believe that we need to have that contact with something wild. And all of the things that we do to kind of constrain our children, protect them, they'll find a way to do it themselves. And I think growing up does involve in some way doing that.
And that's why it's so tragic to in Purge to read again about the Linda character who's so confined. I mean, everybody is put in such confined spaces, and there is no, even Alita, who, like you're saying, is in her 80s in the contemporary part of the story, she is more or less trapped in her home. She's paranoid. She can barely step outside for fear that anybody in the town is going to come and malign her for those sorts of things. And so there is, I mean, it seems that there's an inverse thing there then with what you're writing about, where people are prevented from that kind of communion with what's around them. That the forest, it's very, there's such a juxtaposition there, because when David writes about the forest or things that are sylvan, there again there's that sense of communion, but the forest for you is political, and it's a battleground for people, and it's where they hide out. So obviously there's something about where nature is being kept from people in your writing, and that must be something that you're very aware of when you're writing as well, I assume. And yeah.
Yeah, in the novel, Forest Brothers, the members of resistance movement during the occupation, they were hiding in forest. On the other hand, then there are those Russian mobsters who want to steal the land again and steal the forest. And then there are also Finnish men who want to also to have the forest, because after the regaining the independence, there were again new kind of land reform. You have to get those who own the land and so on. So it is surprisingly political, I admit. On the other hand, I enjoy describing nature. And as well as forest, because I want to, well, of course there's always a metaphorical and a symbolic level, but also because I want to write in a way that the reader goes really into the world of of the characters, and I want to use all the senses, so all the what you can hear or smell or taste, what you can touch, and that's how the senses are very important for me when writing.
Because both of you have it's very immersive, the reading experience for both of you. And if there's anybody who is a writer or writes a fair bit, you can learn a great deal from this, because it's a wonderful thing to read their work in counterpoint, because it's very direct. And you can tell just by the way that David tells the story that there's a very direct way of telling the story, that the language then gilds it as a result. But there is something very poignant about that, because I don't think either of you really sets out to put all of this crazy writing in or to make it interesting, but the stories themselves lead you through the stories very well, and there's a narrative then that's constructed, and the language comes as a result of that. And I think most people who would teach writing or who would want you to write will always tell you that, to just tell the story, and all of those accoutrements of writing will then come in the process of telling it. So there is something very similar there in the way that you narrate. David, were you going to say something in relation to the forest? I saw you jotting away. I didn't know.
Yeah, it was really interesting hearing you talk about the forest. And, you know, we're both Europeans, but whenever I go to Europe and work with European writers, I'm struck by there are such differences between the English experience and the European experience, especially over the last 50 years since, you know, the Second World War and the Soviet Union, that England in many ways escaped so many of the things that happened to Europe in the last century. And you know, people like Sofi have experienced a totally different kind of Europe than I have. And, I'm just constantly struck by, I was struck by Jana Teller's book, a Danish writer who I've been working with this week as well, that there's a different kind of darkness in European writing, which is to do with war, to do with occupation, to do with the kind of dangers of boundaries, the dangers of frontiers, things that happen in the forest. You know, so often that things happen in forests. And it just brought to mind, somebody wrote to me recently and asked me about what is it about English writing, the children's writing that comes from England seems to be very different from a lot of the children's writing that comes to Europe. And I think a lot of it is to do with that, it's to do with that experience of war and of occupation, which England has managed to be protected from.
And you see a similar viewpoint there, the dichotomy between those two things.
Well, I'm not expert on English children's literature, so I can't comment if you can see something like that. When I think about Scandinavia and Finland and my own identity as an author, then Finnish literature world is a bit different from that sense, that you have post-colonial literature in Great Britain as well as also this all the immigrant literature also in other Scandinavian countries, and that is something that is creating a new kind of literary worlds. But actually, we don't have that too much in Finland. Finland is quite isolated.
Well, we are going to have a question and answer portion, and we do have microphones on either end here for any of you who do want to ask a question. So please don't be shy. We'll treat you very well, I guarantee you. But if anybody has a question that he or she would like to ask, please hop up.
Hi, Ms. Oksanen. I read your book and I really loved it. But I was really interested in the way that you dealt with trauma and how it, how this young character, all of the main characters experience these great traumas as young people, but the healing process that you're sort of told you go through as you age doesn't necessarily seem to take for them. Like there's resolution and they seem reconciled, but aging and having a chance to reflect on these events doesn't necessarily give them any sense of closure or there just doesn't seem to be a place of healing. And I wondered if you could say anything on that.
Yeah, When I started to write the story, I made a lot of background research about how what kind of trauma reactions violated people have. Is there something typical of them? And one of them is, it seems to me, that despite the cultural background, religion, all that kind of things that you think that that affect people, how people react or experience things, then actually those didn't matter. There are a few, it seems to me, universal ways to cope with trauma or react, and one of them is that molested people start to avoid looking people in the eye. And that was interesting for me, and that's why actually I thought first that the story should be on stage, because that is something that you really watch. But then one of my favorite historians is Eugene M. Gaith, a professor at the Duke University, who has interviewed Gulag survivors, and for over 10 years. And she has described how hard it is for those people who have managed to survive from those Siberia concentration camps, how to survive something they cannot actually describe in a society that doesn't allow you to talk about that. And all the Western trauma studies, they are insisting that you will survive from trauma when you talk about. But how is it in that kind of world? Well, you can't talk about those traumas, and that's why I actually wanted. That's one reason also why I wanted to write The Purge, because those women in the novel were actually those kind of people who had no possibility to talk about their traumas for most of their lives. Well, it's possible now, but for Alide, who lived through the Soviet occupation, it was not possible for her to talk about that. And actually, now when you were talking about this difference of English literature compared with other European literature, then one difference is that actually you could say that in one way Europe is still divided into Western and Eastern part, because, well, freedom of speech was such a strange thing. It didn't exist in the Eastern European countries for so long, and just starting from 90s, it has been possible to write about what really happened, and it really takes time. So it really takes time, and it also takes time to create language for something that has been silent for so long. And that is something that I think that applies to very many things, that it takes time to create language if you have lived in a silenced world.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. That's a very good question. Anybody else? Don't be shy. We're all friends in here. Yes.
I'm fascinated by this pairing, and it's been very interesting to watch you ask questions that brings out differences and similarities. So that's partly an apology for my question going again to Sofi. I'm wondering about your dual identity as Finnish and Estonian, and I'm wondering about how it felt to write Purge in a country which, as I have experienced it, going to Finland and being, anyway, somehow connected to Finland, Russia is so little on the minds of many Finns. And by nature, it must be very much on the mind still of many Estonians. And how did it feel to write a book about, indirectly about Russia as a Finn now? And do you think that the timing of Purge had something to do with opening up a space inside of Finland, a Western country, Americanized, as you say, to think about its proximity to Russia in many ways?
Yeah. There have been a lot of Finnish readers who have said that Purge has been a very eye-opening experience, and that they have understood about what it has been like to live in an occupied country. That's true. For me, I think it is always good for an author to have some kind of distance to the subject, and therefore I think it is very good for me to write in Finland about Estonia, because it gives a certain distance. And also the language gives a certain distance, because I'm writing in Finnish about something that has happened in Estonia. And that's something that suits me, this kind of combination. But I don't know if I start to write about Finland, then perhaps I have to move to somewhere else to get the distance. Actually, the Soviet past and the occupation history, and also as well as Russian, the language that is still widely spoken in Estonia, it is everyday, part of everyday life. And quite often Western people, not only Finnish people, have asked me, after reading Purge or reading some interviews, have asked that how horrible it was. And then I always say that, I mean, you don't think about that your everyday life is horrible if you don't have actually, when it's normal. It was normal. For me, I mean, if I think about myself as a 10-year-old girl or 5-year-old girl, I wasn't thinking that this is how tragic the life is. No, it was a normal way to let this life, and so, or how horrible it is. No, it was normal that it was so hard to travel to somewhere. It was normal, and so that's why I felt quite impossible to complain about this kind of, and it was normal to be silent. And I, for example, I never wrote. I've always written diaries. Started at the age of 6 when I learned to write, but I never wrote diary when we were in Estonia or when we were traveling around Soviet Union. No. So that is something that I noticed just as an adult when I was thinking that why didn't I? Actually, it was so obvious. No writing here.
That should have been the motto with the volcano. We're all Estonian, because then it really took a long time for anybody to get anywhere. And we have time for one more question. Anybody? Yes.
Hi, this has been a really fantastic panel, and Sophie, it was really interesting what you were saying about being the insider-outsider experience, being a better way to write about an experience. David, do you find that in any way reflects writing for children? Because you were a child, but you no longer are one, so in some ways it's a very good insider-outsider relationship.
I think the idea of insider-outsider is really interesting, and I mean, I write about, in many ways, I write about, you know, it seems like my own experience, but actually it's not. I'm kind of writing about experience which is mine, but actually it's not. I'm an outsider. And I think in order to become a writer, you have to kind of create your own mythology. And a lot of my mythology is to do with the fact that I'm kind of English, but actually I'm not really English. That I write about in a language which is normally excluded from sort of English cultural life in England. The kind of area that I write about, the language that I write in, the people that I write about, are kind of conventionally uncultured, aside from the mainstream culture. So I had to kind of move out of that culture and then look back at it again, and write in a kind of English that some people would say, well, that's not English. So it's an odd thing that all writers somehow have to become outsiders, I think. Even though you're writing from the heart of an experience, yet also outside that experience and kind of looking into it. And it is that dual thing, that tension between being outside something and inside something. And I quite enjoy that. Now also, one of the things I like about being a children's writer as well is that a lot of people will say, well, you're not a proper writer, are you, because you're just writing for children. But actually, if you're in that kind of position, it also gives you a great deal of freedom as well, because you can dodge and duck about and do all kinds of things that actually, if you were saying, yes, I am a proper cultured writer, you wouldn't be able to do. You wouldn't be able to do the kind of things that I've been able to do, kind of nominally writing for children, are blocked from a lot of people who just write for sophisticated, grown-up, educated adults.
Well, to again remind you, their most recent books are Clay and Purge. They will blow you away. They're very, very good. And I thank you very much for being here today. And just a reminder that they will be signing books after today's panel. So thank you very much, and have a good day.